Absolutely. So thank you for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for committing some time to this rather than enjoying the ridiculously hot day out there. So my name is Carl Gottlieb. I'm the Data Protection Officer at Zengenti. So my role is to help our organization and in turn help all of you and our clients get a good private secure solution from us and keep our data and your data safe. So the role, what I'm going to do today is talk to you about cookie banners as they kind of relate to everyone individually, organizations, but the most value any of you will get out of this is to learn kind of from each other. So please, as was mentioned, dive in with a question. If you've got something about you and your organization, ask it. We'll answer it straight away, hopefully, and no doubt will be relevant to everyone else listening and watching today. So please ask. Many of you work for very similar kind of organizations, so please, it will be relevant to you all, so please do dive in. Now, cookie banners, one thing I should say from a kind of privacy professional as myself is that, we do actually hate them. Don't think that we like these things just because we tell you you have to have them. We're kind of no fans of them at all. And when I'm going to talk through this kind of presentation, the thing to note is that we're not really talking about cookies. We're talking about anything active, the kind of dynamic stuff on a web page. So generally, we're talking about scripts like JavaScript. Some people call them tags, others just cookies, but it's really any of that active, usually tracking type stuff that goes on. So let's start with the law as to what actually we've got to really comply with. And there's two, in the kind of European sense of this, we're really talking about two types of laws. One is GDPR. The other one, which is just as important, if not more, is the ePrivacy Directive. And the ePrivacy Directive is, by its name, a directive and not a regulation. And what that meant was when that came out, that told all of the 28 EU countries, you've got to go and implement this in your own way. So unlike the GDPR, which is like one law across the whole of the EU, each country implemented the directive in its own way. So in the UK, we created our own regulation based on that called PECA, great name, the Privacy and Electronic Communication Regulations. And PECA is sometimes called the cookie law. So you'll often hear people interchangeably talk about PECA or the ePrivacy Directive. They are essentially the same thing with some slight kind of UK interpretations of what the directive wants you to do. But if you have to comply with, let's say, UK form of ePrivacy Directive or the French one or the Dutch one, they're all going to be pretty identical with a few tiny tweaks. But that's one of the reasons why you will get some different interpretations across the EU in terms of how regulators and how different organizations interpret some of this stuff. So splitting those two apart, starting out with the GDPR, a few key things to say about the GDPR. One is that it's actually about personal data. It's about that rich data that exists. It's not about any other kind of data. If it helps identify somebody, it's personal data. It's in scope of the GDPR. You've got to have a lawful basis to process it. So things like you've got to pick one of six. So do you have a contract? Do you have a public interest? Do you have a legal reason? Do you have consent? That kind of thing. And lastly, GDPR also defines what consent is. So when PECA talks about consent, it relies on the GDPR definition of that. And that's why back in 2018, when GDPR came out, PECA got slightly changed. The law didn't change, but its definition of consent did, which is why you've started seeing cookie banners change recently. And PECA, a few things to say about that is, in the kind of cookie sense of the world, it regulates what you kind of do with cookies around non-essential processing. And that's a really key thing we'll talk about today. The other really interesting thing is PECA is only relating to public networks. So if you've got an intranet or an internal system that's only accessed internally, then it's not in scope of this. It's only things that are publicly accessible. So, okay, how does this actually relate into technical requirements from the law? So starting out with PECA, and the reason we start with PECA is because it's actually the most prescriptive. And PECA is the one that says it regulates electronic communications like the internet and websites. And it says that if you're going to drop essential, like non-essential cookies or scripts, or basically anything that requires processing on the laptop, on the workstation, on the end device, the smartphone, then you need prior consent before they get enabled. And that's a really key thing to say, is that you can drop all this stuff only after you've been given consent. So you can't do it by default and then ask for consent and then turn it off afterwards. It's an opt-in rule. It's based on that model of consent that we now know of. You've got to ask for stuff first. Another way of describing that is privacy by design and by default. I land on a service like a website, it should be private by default. Now, GDPR alongside that says, well, okay, what about the actual data that's going to get sent inside those kind of scripts that go on? So think about Google Analytics or some screen recording thing. If there's any personal data in there, let's say a name, an IP address, an email address, then we're now in personal data scope, and so GDPR comes into place. You have to think about GDPR. And GDPR will start saying things like, well, if you're going to have consent, I need to actually see proof of it. You can't have consent without proof. It doesn't exist. And if you're going to share that data with another third party for a purpose of a different use, and a good example of that is if you share data with Facebook, then they're going to say, thanks very much, and I'll keep that forever and use it for my own purposes. For instance, if I share my WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger tool for uploading my contacts list from my phone, they'll happily keep that forever, and then keep like a shadow profile or wait for some user to sign up and then kind of match that back to my list. So when you share data with these organizations, some of them keep it for their own purpose. And when you're doing that, GDPR is very much involved. Now, I mentioned that GDPR has this definition of consent to kind of provide to both GDPR and PECA. And consent must be freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous. So what that kind of means is generally no surprises. You can't accidentally give consent. And if there's no proof that consent was given, then there is no consent. You must be informed as to exactly what is going to be done with my data. And it can't be for just generally anything like third-party marketing. It must be for specific things. So it's got to be really, really well defined and fair and transparent. And lastly, consent is kind of great in the sense that if you can give consent, you must be able to withdraw consent just as easily. So if you've got an app or a website that asks for consent for whether it be cookies or for marketing, then you must be able to offer a way to opt out of that, withdraw that consent in exactly the same ease in the same kind of place. You can't say, oh, you've now got to jump through these 5 hurdles to withdraw that consent. Now, 2 quick points about GDPR. It has these definitions of data controller and data processor. Very simply, a controller decides what to do with the data. A processor is like the service provider that acts under their direct instructions. So imagine you're a student at university, the data controller for their data will be the university, and the university might store their data in Amazon's AWS backend, for which case they're only allowed to do what the university tells them to do with that data. There is no relationship between that AWS, the data processor, and the student. It's all mediated through the data controller. The data processor has no rights over that data whatsoever. And that's kind of important as we talk about kind of cookies. Okay, so what actually is a cookie banner? Well, if you ask any of the cookie banner vendors, they'll say it's not a cookie banner. It's a cookie consent and website scanning content management platform, which is basically nonsense to you and me. What they're really trying to say is that you can't just have a cookie banner and think you're done. You've got to have a much bigger thing these days. You've got to have the banner itself that says what's going on. You've got to kind of audit what's going on on the website to know what things to allow and what not. You've got to have some dynamic system that the cookie banner uses to give people the ability to toggle on and off those cookies. So let's say you've got Google Analytics. Cookie banner can't just say, we have Google Analytics, deal with it. It has to say, well, here's a way of turning it on or turning it off. And that's often called a preference center. And that must allow that dynamic, that real-time enabling, disabling of those components or scripts. So Many of you are thinking now about your own website and the kind of scripts and consent you might be needing, and what's needed for those. So this is a table with a lot of information in it, but let's start at the top. There's really two colors going on here, green and red. Apologies for those of you that are red-green colorblind. That was my bad. But at the top, we're simply saying that if you've got something essential, let's say a component that is like a load balancer or a CDN or the type of thing that might use cookies and scripts, and you need it to keep the website working, and if you turn it off, it will break, then you don't need consent for them. And you don't need to provide an ability to disable that kind of stuff. And you can enable it by default. So it's completely allowed and permitted by default by the ePrivacy Directive or PECA. If you look at many privacy policies and cookie notices, they'll often say, you can disable this stuff by disabling JavaScript in your browser, but it will break things. So kind of that's your own risk. Now, the other category is the one in red, like the bottom three lines. And what we're saying here is, if it's non-essential, you need consent. And that's pretty much it. There's not a huge amount more to say about it, but I've broken it out into 3 different sections to go through. So you've got functionality-based ones, and those might be things like, would you like to remember your password, or remember the language setting you've enabled for this website, or maybe you've got a chat box in there with a third party. All those kind of things can't be enabled by default, but they are seen as like functional stuff that you might want to put into a category called like functional cookies or functional scripts and allow people to opt into them, because many people would probably say that's quite useful. I'd like to be able to opt into that. The next one is the kind of first party tracking, and I won't dive into first party versus third party because it gets a bit weird on that. But first party, what we're talking about here is first party in the sense of it's the website kind of owner hosting those analytics. So, first party, the data controller or the kind of website host controlling that data. So they're either storing it in their own server or they're storing it on a service provider like Google Analytics, but there's no data sharing going on. So it kind of doesn't matter where they're storing that data, it's about them controlling it. And the EU regulators call that first party. And I know the website masters out there in the audience will be thinking Google Analytics isn't first party, but what they mean is you are the first party controlling it, not giving it to some random third party. And those ones, even they need consent. Now this, many of you will be thinking, is ridiculous. So if you look at something like PWIC, that is a really kind of basic analytics platform that doesn't share data with anyone. You stick it on your web server and records hits and doesn't track people too much. Even those analytics require prior consent if you follow the law precisely. And the third one is a third party tracking, where we're saying we're going to allow a third party to take some of that data and kind of reuse it for their own purpose. So if you take Google Analytics, at its most basic level, it doesn't provide anything fancy. It doesn't give Google any data or any ability to reuse that data. It means Google are just a data processor by default. But if you've ever used it, you'll know you can turn on demographics and ad tracking and all those kind of things. The same that you can with Facebook Pixel and LinkedIn traffic and Google Ads, where you're effectively sharing data with that third party. You're not asking them to process it, you're sharing it. Basically, you're giving it away. And when you're doing that, you definitely require consent because of GDPR, but you're already caught into the consent bubble of PECA requiring that. So again, this is something that the marketing people especially dislike when you tell them that Facebook Pixel or ad retargeting or attribution for ads requires prior consent. Again, you can't enable it until you get consent. Really key point. So what I'm going to do now is give you some examples of how some major websites are handling how they comply or try to comply or don't comply with these rules and regulations. So what I'd recommend is you go into full screen mode now for this, because some of this is going to get quite small. So At the bottom of this one, this is IKEA's website, freshly loaded up in incognito mode. And you can see at the bottom, they've got their cookie banner going on. Now, this is actually a pretty good example of compliance. So I'll explain what's going on here. So the first thing, they've got a banner, great. They're telling you what they're doing with cookies, but they're explaining it in detail about why they use cookies, like what for. So they say we use cookies to personalize content and ads. So they're explaining kind of the why and what. They also give you a link to their cookie policy. You could do it in your privacy policy, it doesn't kind of really matter, but they're explaining, where you can find out more information. And you've got a button here to configure what cookies you want to enable. Now, on the right, they've gone with a 2-button approach. By law, you have to have at least 2 buttons. You can have 2 or 3, and I'll talk about that more as we go along. The 2 buttons here, on the right, we've got an allow button or an accept button that says, yeah, give me everything. The one on the left says, let me check more details and let me configure those. So before I dive into that, another thing to notice is about that privacy by default thing I talked about. And if we use a tool like Ghostery here, you can see there's actually no tracking enabled on this website yet. Facebook Pixel isn't loaded. LinkedIn tracking isn't loaded. So they're obeying that privacy by default thing. And no doubt if I was to accept that, it would turn everything on. We can see that in a minute. So if I click on cookie settings, then it loads up their preference center that I mentioned earlier on. And they've actually got 4 categories here, probably similar to the 4 that I showed before. So the first one is the kind of essential category, where you can see that says it's always active, kind of that's how it has to be. Otherwise things will break. And then you've got these other 3 categories. They've gone with, let's say, targeting, and you can imagine the kind of things on there, so like advertising, functional, that could be the ones we talked about before, like remembering configuration details about the website. And they've only got another one for performance, so that might be like first-party tracking. Now, one of the comments say about this is they don't actually explain what's inside this category. So if I tick that, what am I actually going to enable? So that's maybe a criticism you could make about this, or a comment you can make about this implementation. But let's just say we want to allow everything. And as soon as I say allow, which is the same as saying accept all there, then what no doubt will happen is it will allow the web page to load all of its components. And you can see now in Ghostery, you've got everything kind of loaded up, like Google Ads, Facebook Pixel, Google Ads, ad tracking stuff, all sorts of things going on there. So let's move on to another example, the Lush. So the one that sell that lovely smelling soap that you can't get out of your face in a shopping center. So they've again got a nice big cookie banner at the bottom, and they use a different vendor for their cookie controlling thing. IKEA used a company called OneTrust, which created a product called Cookie Pro. This one, I think it's called CookieBot, and you can see you get a different kind of interface. And what they've got here is essentially the same thing, where you've got an OK to allow everything, and you've got a show details that gives you that preference center all kind of embedded in the first page. Now, some pros of doing this in the first page is there's less friction because there's less to kind of click through. The other side of it is you could say it looks ugly. I've got my own opinion on this, but the other thing to say is they've got necessary ticked by default, as it kind of should be, but they've also got statistics ticked. And what they're saying here is if you click OK, that will turn on that. But it's not quite sure, it doesn't really show you anything else that might get turned on. According to this, they've got 3 categories: necessary, statistics, and unclassified with nothing in it. So it's a little bit confusing. It's quite technical, so maybe not as pretty as what the other model was. But again, you can see they've gone with the privacy by default mode of nothing already loaded in here. And if I was to click OK, it'll probably load Google Analytics. So let's see what's loaded now. Yeah, Google Analytics and some other analytics platforms, as you can see. Let's have a look at the BBC. Now, the BBC use their own platform for this. They kind of home custom built what they've got. And the first thing they have is when they change their privacy policy, they actually put a banner up that makes you kind of sort of accept that. So you can see it there. When you click OK of that, you'll then see their cookie banner. Now, again, you've got a 2-button model here, the yes and the settings button. One thing to note is that notice how they weight the two the same. There's no kind of, they're not promoting one above the other, and that's important. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Let's look at what's on by default. Not sure what that is. Hopefully it's okay. But if we go to their settings, rather than that kind of preference center we're used to, they've got their own kind of embedded preference center. You can see what's going on here. So again, functional, and then personalized ads type stuff. And then you can find out more information. But you can see the same kind of model. And then the last one is The Economist. So the first thing to note about The Economist, again, nice big banner with an allow button, and their other button, that kind of settings button, they've kind of embedded in the block of text here. You see you've got manage your cookies down the bottom. So not quite as transparent. You could argue about how you can control that, but the really key thing to note is what's on by default. And if I look at Ghostery, it is every tracker in the world has been turned on. So you can look through this list and you've got 45 things turned on there, whereas IKEA had 0. You've got everything going on here. So even if they claim they've got consent by when you click allow, they didn't have it on by default. So they've not got consent now and they're already tracking me. So you see that issue going on. And let's have a quick look about what their manage cookies button looks like their preference centers. If I click on that, they've got one of these things where it's a lot of information. Like there's all sorts of things. Like if do I want to configure which ad server provider? All sorts. There's quite a lot of criticism of this because you could argue that it's not really fair because it's too difficult to see what's going on and no one could possibly understand it, especially a child. So going back to the top, fortunately, they've got an opt-out all button that I can click on. And it's now trying to opt out, is it? I don't really know. See how it's a bit of a delay. Not the best user interface and a little bit slow there, but apparently that's done the job. So let's just see if it actually did it and look at Ghostery, what it's got live now. In theory, it should have opted out of everything. So doesn't look like it, does it? There's still some stuff going on. So you've got DoubleClick by Google Ads, you've got some analytics stuff, some Bing ads. Still says 43 things there. It's hard to know really what's going on with that one. So we'll kind of move on. And the last one, this is a kind of a privacy company provider, but thing to note is their cookie banner and how they implement it. The cookie banner they have here is actually the same one that IKEA have, but they've gone with 3 buttons rather than 2. Remember, IKEA didn't have this middle button, this kind of deny all or disable all button. They just had allow or customize. Different regulators, different opinions on whether you need 3 buttons or not. The French recently thought you need to have 3. The Dutch aren't sure. British, not quite sure. It's a bit vague, but you need at least 2. And they've got 3. Now, the other key thing to notice here is they weight the 2 the same. There's no promotion of allow versus disable. And if you look at most people's cookie banners, they try and push you towards the allow button. Whereas here they're saying, we're neutral. We're fair, it's completely fair to you. You can choose, we're not pressuring you. And remember that definition of consent needs to be freely given. I can't be pressured into or influenced into giving one or the other. So some of you may call this nudging. So the regulators say you can't negatively nudge people. There can't be any privacy negative nudges that might nudge you into turning on analytics. So again, I can click on customize and see their privacy sense, which they've got a different kind of banner on the left, so a different kind of box on the left, but you could display it how you like. Now, the other one interesting thing to say about this one is their cookie notice. Now, all of you will have to build some kind of cookie notice on a privacy policy or something that says, here's all the cookies we can process and script and so on. Now, a few of these vendors provide a dynamic way of generating that. And Cookie Pro from OneTrust actually create this for you. So you get a basic web page, like an empty web page, and just put in it just a little box that simply says like insert cookie policy. And this is what they've done on this web page. So this is like a block of text, free text they just added onto the web page, and below it, everything from this green button down is dynamically populated in real time. So I know this is small, see if we make it bigger. But what you can see is that in their back end, up in some cloud somewhere, they're actually categorizing and auditing their website probably every day for cookies. So if somebody does add, let's say, Facebook Pixel, it'll automatically get dropped into one of these categories like targeting down here at the bottom and automatically populate their cookie notice. So if you think you've got maybe a complex or long amount of cookies that you want categorized and displayed here, or you think people are going to be changing this a fair amount, like marketing people or whoever, without your kind of knowledge, then this is a way of dynamically keeping your cookie notice up to date. Okay, so those are the four main examples: IKEA, Lush, BBC, and The Economist. So the providers that I'll mention some of the providers I talked about actually. So these are four that are kind of really good, I should say. There's actually quite a few more, but these are probably the four main ones. Cookie Pro, really, really popular one. Civic, this is an interesting one because their functionality is quite rough and basic, but it is a British company and many government departments in the UK use it. The ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, actually use it. It's not the prettiest one in the world, so you kind of pick and choose. CookieBot, that's that one that had loads of information inside the banner. A bit rough, but quite good. Matomic is a new one. They're quite a cool vendor. I think they're British, good people and worth kind of looking at. Again, it's all the same kind of thing: a banner, preference center, cookie policy generation, all that kind of stuff, and fairly pretty. Great, so that's the end of the presentation. So if you've got